So some of the other scriptures that explain this, Ezekiel 22, verse 26 and verse 31, her priests have violated my law and profaned my holy things. They put no difference between the profane and the holy. They have hid their eyes from my Sabbaths, and I am profaned among them. Therefore I have poured out my indignation on them. You know, one of the reasons I was convinced of the Sabbath truth is because after I first learned these things, I went to my pastors. I used to go to church on Sunday. I was so into Christianity, I was going to several different churches. One church said we'd have a Wednesday night Bible study, I'd be there. Then I go to another denomination, I'd be at their service. Another one would have a special early morning service. I went there. I was going to 4 or 5 different churches, studying with all these Christian groups in Southern California. I was just hungry. I couldn't get enough. But when I learned the Sabbath truth, I'd ask the different pastors, I'd say, so why do we go to church on Sunday? And if you ask 10 different pastors, you would get 11 different answers. One would say, these are just a few examples. Doug, we're no longer under the 10 commandments. We're now under grace. I said, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that we don't need to keep the 10 commandments? They said, well, we're not under the law. I said, well, wait, help me understand that. Is it okay now to kill? Well, no. Steal? No. Lie? No. Commit adultery? No. What they really meant is, there's one commandment you're not supposed to remember anymore. That's the Sabbath. I said, but isn't that the one that says remember? So that didn't make sense. And so I talked to another one. He said, because of the resurrection, Jesus rose on the first day of the week, and so it is the new Christian Sabbath. I said, that sounds beautiful. I said, where is the scripture that tells us that? Well, there is no specific scripture, but we've got a long-standing tradition, as though there's some value in that. And then I had another friend, he was the most creative. And he said, Doug, back in the days of Joshua, you remember Joshua prayed and the sun stood still. Saturday turned into Sunday back then. And I said, well, that's interesting. I said, except why did they continue to keep it on the seventh day for another 1,500 years after that? And he couldn't answer that. And they were all giving me different, they didn't agree with each other. I said, something's wrong. They are hiding their eyes from a very obvious truth because they have counted the cost of what will it mean if I take a stand for this biblical truth? I'll lose my congregation. I'll be very unpopular. I know pastors that have taken a stand and it cost them. I know some pastors took a stand for the truth and the majority of the church followed them in the Sabbath truth. And so it's always better.
No, we aren't hiding our eyes to the Sabbath truth, Doug. Neither are pastors like mine or any other first-day Sabbatarian. If anything, affirming the first-day Sabbath costs you because then you get both Seventh-day Sabbatarians like you misrepresenting us and making conspiracy claims that we're tools of Satan. Then on the other hand, we get Christians that reject Sunday as being any sort of significant day, and they're mad that we think it should be kept by Christians. What we have a problem with is your fiction that the seventh-day Sabbath is the seal of God, that a person's salvation hinges on it, that Sunday will be the mark of the beast eventually, and so on. We also have a problem with you memorializing the broken creation that Adam plunged into sin, not recognizing that man prior to the fall started his week with the Sabbath, and that Jesus, the substance of the Sabbath, came and restored what man broke and brought about a new creation, which is memorialized on the day he accomplished it, the first day. He mentioned when somebody says, we worship on the first day because of the resurrection. Doug, this is a summation statement. It should include a therefore before it. Meaning, after all that, we worship on the first day because of the resurrection. It's because of the resurrection, or it's because the resurrection is the day in which the new creation was inaugurated by virtue of Christ accomplishing the work he came to do. After that completed work, it was time for him to return to his rightful abode, entering his rest by sitting down on his throne as a priest king. This is what Eusebius was referring to earlier, picking that up from the Psalm as well as Hebrews 4. To rule and reign over all things as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, reaping the fruits of his labors of the work of redemption. In conjunction with what I talked about earlier, the Sabbath in redemption, folks, looks like this. The first day memorializes redemption being accomplished. That happened at the resurrection. The new creation was ushered in by virtue of Jesus, who redeemed that post-fall creation that fell into sin, accomplished that work successfully, and entered his rest, God's rest, ahead of us. And the day he entered his rest serves as a memorial that points us to that, what we look forward to. Man breaks the creation, plunges it into sin. Remember, pre-fall, it was God's seventh day, not man's. Based on evening to evening, it was man's first. Man was fashioned and prepared on day 6, preparation day, to then enter God's rest, holy communion and fellowship with God. After the fall, the promise of redemption is then given in Genesis 3:15, with redemptive history leading to the incarnation, where God himself enters the broken creation, redeems it, and restores man to his right relationship with God. He accomplished that work successfully and is now making all things new presently, Revelation 21:5, on the pathway to the second coming, where he will return to defeat the last enemy, which is death, 1 Corinthians 15. And then we'll cast that into the lake of fire, which will usher us into being resurrected in glorified bodies, and we will finally physically enter into eternity with God. That's the consummation of all things. That is what the Sabbath is about, not the SDA twisting and microscoping in on one aspect of redemptive history and then making that the substance while attributing everything to some grand conspiracy by Satan to deceive people. And he instituted Sunday as a trick and a deception and so on. Both in the old and new creation, the memorial ultimately pointed to the same thing, the rest that remains for us to enter into. And one will enter into there by believing the gospel. That's what the author in Hebrews 4 is imploring. Israel heard the good news. They had it preached to them, but they didn't enter. They were observing a day. The day is a memorial, not the substance like the SDA church makes it. Not that it points to the eternal rest of entering into eternity with God, but that in eternity, there's going to be a 7-day cycle and the seventh-day Sabbath will be observed. Completely missing the point. It's not a return to Eden. Mount Zion is better. Eden was a starting point in the plan of God to enter into creation himself in the person of Christ, redeeming a people, demonstrating his justice towards sin, his grace and love in saving a people, fix what man broke, and then bring himself ultimately glory out of all of that. That was always the plan, not a plan B afterthought like Ellen portrays in The Great Controversy. But Doug and SDAs present this claim as though it said, because Jesus resurrected Sunday, well, now we worship on that day, and that's it. When in reality, it's way more theologically rich than that. We see the Sabbath all throughout redemptive history, leading and pointing us to Jesus, where the story then climaxes to the person and work of God coming in the flesh to restore everything man broke, ushering us back into fellowship and union with God. Rest for the soul in the gospel, and eventually rest for the body when we receive glorification, which will be a better state than Adam and Eve were in. But because he went to some pastors down the street and asked them about the Sabbath and they didn't have a strong understanding in this area, that means Christians as a whole have no basis. Doug, I've talked with Adventist pastors, lots of them, and they all present Adventism differently, with none of them agreeing on what it means to fundamentally be an Adventist. So that must mean that no Adventists know or have a baseline for what it means to be an Adventist, right? He doesn't even know the serious theological arguments because he didn't actually consult any sort of theologian that has spent time exegeting scripture regarding the Sabbath. Like a Nicholas Bound or a John Owen. Shoot, any of the ancient. Just read their homilies. They're expounding upon scripture and they're bringing this out. It's like they have this weird aversion to church fathers around like ooh, icky. You're just like, oh, they don't look identical to how I am. Okay, you can still look at this and say, historically, that's what people were saying. This is long before Constantine. They're not just saying, oh, just because of the resurrection. Instead, he uses low-hanging fruit examples of well-meaning Christians who just aren't as learned on this, and then broad brushes. Classic Doug Batchelor move. Doug, you should have consulted theologians and theological works. Just because you found some pastors that, believe it or not, are not all-knowing and didn't have a sufficient answer for you doesn't mean that it's not out there. For too long, Protestantism just took this for granted and didn't have a strong apologetic or teaching around this subject. But it's been there. The understanding was around long before SDAs were around. I mean, we just look to individuals back to the 2nd century. It's been discussed theologically for almost 2,000 years. I mean, read the Puritans that your pioneers borrowed from, but then twisted. This idea that you have to search far and wide, and he tries to portray it like this to find an answer. Doug, you have a computer. Get on your computer. Let's hear you respond to the actual theological arguments, not just low-hanging fruit. Pointing to people who just weren't equipped on this subject is not an argument. If I utilize that standard against Adventism, mercy. I could make Adventism look horrible. Just ask 10 different Adventists about the sanctuary. You'll get 12 different answers, Doug. Well, then again, you actually may get multiple people saying it's confusing. So maybe it wouldn't be 12 different answers. But we could then, by Doug's standard, say the SDA church is confused and they don't even know what they believe about the sanctuary teaching. No one does. And guess what they would do? Send us to their scholars, which means I rest my case. Adventists can say what they want about this platform, that I misrepresent them, I'm clueless, yada, yada. But I actually interact with their scholastic materials and official source materials, not low-hanging fruit, not Joe Schmo SDA down the block. No, Ministry Magazine, the Adventist Theological Society papers, BRI articles, Ellen White writings, writings from the pioneers. But individuals like Doug don't actually have to do that. They get to rattle off their script and their talking points and proof texts, make claims about others, but not actually read the materials of those that they criticize and actually learn what they believe. Because it's a closed system. He can just give these sorts of talks to a room full of SDAs that just, oh yeah, brother, oh yeah, and they just eat it up and it just keeps the fuel in the machine. But also, Doug, your friend Ted Wilson at his annual council speech, both this year and last year, and in a new video that was uploaded today that we're going to respond to, told us to be on the lookout for anyone not utilizing the historical grammatical method of interpretation. He even warned of the same thing at the Hold the Line conference that you had at your own church. You didn't utilize the HGM. You just rattled off proof text like you did earlier. So I guess we need to keep an eye out for you. Okay, so now he's going to begin addressing all of the first day passages, starting with Matthew 28.